Season 10 has been a roller coaster ride, with big ups and some terrifyingly low downs. So I think it'd be fun to just look back at what we've been through this year out on Summoner's Rift. What's up, Summoners? My name is Zyrene, and I'm going to run you guys through our Season 10 rewind. We'll talk about all the stuff we went through, crazy patches, the birth of a beautiful meme, and much more. We've started a Wild Rift channel, by the way, so make sure to check it out if you're interested in playing. Also, if you're looking to get better at League, I want you guys to know about our ProGuides guarantee. If you don't climb 5 divisions with our Pro subscription, we'll give you an additional 6 months for free. Check out our website to learn more. Now, looking back on Season 10, there's only one thing, and one thing that people will remember forever. We're not going to remember the little things, no matter how impactful they were. Giving marksmen quality of life buffs, nerfing overtuned runes, and other various balance changes that made the game better are going to be outshone by one thing and one thing only: 200 plus years of collective professional game design experience. Let's run it from the top. Patch 10.1, where it all began. We're not going to run through every little change for these patches, but we'll make sure to hit the big stuff. Aphelios was released during the preseason, but patch 10.1 became the birth of our ever so loved meme of the year. This guy was absolutely disgusting. The preseason might not have conveyed this as players were still learning him, but a lot of them were taking time off from the game altogether. Here's the thing about him though, he actually got nerfed for the first 4 patches of the season. Patches 10.1, 10.2, 10.3, and 10.4 documented a balance change for him. I guess he was just that broken, but it took a minute for the balance team to get to work. Hence, there are now countless clips or montages of Aphelios one-shotting entire teams with his ultimate hovering all over the internet. One day, surely, new players will stumble upon these clips and eagerly pick him up, unaware of the countless nerfs he's received since then. 10.1 also marks the release of another champion, who was clearly a bit too strong. Set's one-dimensional nature gave many players the impression that it was okay for him to be that strong. However, his win rates were absolutely absurd upon release, and he quickly shot up to the top of tier lists, sporting win rates as high as 55%. Ever since then, we've seen Set a lot in both competitive games and solo queue. However, a ton of balance changes have made him much less prominent in pro play. The end of Season 9 was a crazy one, with the release of Senna, a marksman that could also be played as support. This was absolutely game-changing, and by the second patch of the season, players were beginning to figure out how to play her optimally. One such phenomenon was fasting Senna. Forfeit farming as a marksman and giving it to your support was innovative, creative, and actually pretty damn strong. Senna and Tahm Kench proved to be one of the strongest duo lanes in the game. Senna's incredible scaling, as well as a farmed-up Tahm Kench, could prove to be an amazing asset to the team. While Tahm Kench was a rather lackluster pick for the majority of the season, Senna's synergy with him easily brought him out of the gutter and into the S tier. Although dependent on Senna to succeed, it was kinda cool seeing Tahm Kench be unbenched, and actually proved to be a powerful pick again. This duo wouldn't pick up until a few patches later, but we're certain that it was roughly around this time that players began experimenting with her. That said, we've been through a lot of different bottom lane metas this season, but do you guys remember the first queen of the bottom lane this year? Caitlyn had her run rather recently, but going all the way back, it doesn't take too much to remember the days of Misfortune running a train through the bottom lane. While she's recently run it back, she was just built different early on in the season. Misfortune was fast, hit like a truck, was one of the few marksmen who could actually put up a challenging fight, and as a result, was basically unstoppable. The game also proved to be a bit fast-paced this season, leading to the meta shifting towards early game and mid-game dominant bottom laners. They could control the pace of the bottom lane and also take lane priority to set up for some easy dragons. Supports saw some love as a result of Senna's release. Their full potential could be brought out with some increased income and the meta diversified. Kind of. More money meant more power, and do you guys remember what was going on in the top lane? Sona and Janna were both top lane monsters. Whether or not they were picking up farm, they were able to build up a decent amount of income with their support items, namely Spell Thief's Edge. While your opponents are farming minions, you would be farming them. Once you complete the upgrade, you would just farm like normal, pick up a ton of gold, and become the most oppressive support imaginable. These picks became dominant forces in both solo queue and the competitive scene. If you had told me supports in the top lane would become a thing during the preseason, I would have avoided League like the plague until they nerfed them. And that they did, a little bit later during patch 10.4. And our Supreme Overlords were nerfed. Soraka and Sona both fell victim to some pretty hefty balance changes. The gameplay patterns were unhealthy, and while diversity in the game is great, developers agreed that this was not fun or good for the game. So they nerfed support top laners. Everything was perfectly balanced. We finally found world peace, and humanity prospered. Which is absolutely not what happened, because this is the same patch that they buffed all the Immolate items: Bomby Cinder, Sunfire Cape, and Cinderhulk. In fact, all these items had to get hotfixed in the same patch because they were so strong. This is when Amumu and Rammus became the most OP junglers in the game. They received buffs alongside a buff to their core item. We also saw Ornn dominate the top lane. Maokai followed as a close second, and these guys could easily 1v1 any carry and was looking like a tank meta was emerging once again. Hence, another meme's birth. ADC in 2020. There's no doubt that marksmen felt a bit weak at this time, and that's because they were. When a tank with a single item could easily 1v1 other champions with an item advantage over them, it definitely wasn't a good time to be a marksman player. Next up was patch 10.5, a patch with a ton of hotfixes. With tanks so strong, we actually saw Riot make an attempt to keep them in check by buffing Blade of the Ruined King. It received a massive buff for melee champions, meaning that top lane fighters and bruisers would be able to build it against tanks. However, the buff was massive, and it proved to be more than just a tank-busting item. It increased the damage output of several top lane carries significantly. Blade of the Ruined King became an S-tier item overnight, and it proves to be one, time and time again. Another remedy Riot added to the game was a change to support items. This was probably one of the healthiest changes ever made. Support items would only provide gold with an ally nearby. From this patch onward, you could no longer purchase a support item and head into the solo lane. Players would trade minions for opportunities to constantly harass their opponent. In spite of this gameplay pattern, they could come out on top, and ironically be rewarded for not farming. Of course, a ton of us were frustrated by this, and Riot brought down the hammer on that playstyle. One other big change that can honestly go forgotten is the change to boots this patch. Boots of Mobility had its price increased, while Boots of Swiftness had its movement speed bonus increased. We rarely saw anyone ever opt into building Boots of Swiftness, while Boots of Mobility were simply too strong. They dominated the meta during Worlds 2019 as they allowed for some scrappy gameplay. Taking damage didn't matter as long as you didn't die. You could quickly recall and just as quickly get back into lane. Because they were so cheap, players by this patch had figured out just how strong these boots were, and Riot quickly acted to nerf an OP pair of shoes while buffing up some under-purchased ones. Patch 10.6 did it yet again, fanning the flames of a meme that burned strong and showed no signs of ever dying out. 200 plus years, once again, proved itself with the new, improved, and absolutely broken Wukong. With more power, 2 knockups with a single ultimate, and some quality of life improvements, the Monkey King shook up Summoner's Rift. The top lane and jungle were particularly dangerous places to be, as Wukong proved to be a powerful flex pick in both roles. While he did receive nerfs in following patches, Wukong reigned supreme and had a solid run for several patches. He was hotfixed the same patch he was released as well, because he was just that broken. I do have a hot take here though. Wukong was definitely broken, but I don't think he was that broken. What was actually the most broken thing about him was Death's Dance. This item got a huge rework this patch, providing a ton of defensive stats, and it became an instant buy for all roles aside from supports. Teleport also had its cooldown adjusted and a movement speed bonus added. This was a patch intended to help out top laners, and it definitely did. Maybe a little too much. We made meme after meme, as Riot's recent releases proved to be overtuned upon release. However, we saw something different with their next release. Fiddlesticks was released the following patch, 10.7. In his case, while we now know that he was broken, Fiddlesticks kind of flopped. His win rates were absurdly low and seemed to sit on the weaker side. Without a doubt, support Fiddlesticks wasn't the same beast that he once was, while jungle Fiddlesticks was still struggling to find success overall. Some players knew that this guy was cracked, but his absurdly low win rates led players to believe otherwise. Riot actually mentioned this in one of their dev blogs. It was actually to be expected that Fiddlesticks wouldn't start off strong. With his rework in place, Fiddlesticks' power was shifted heavily towards the trickery and mind games players could utilize against their opponents. It would take some time for us to adjust to these changes, and look at where Fiddlesticks is now. He's a monster. Wanna guess who was nerfed in patch 10.8? Well, it was Aphelios, again. There were a ton of other balance changes here too, but honestly nothing game-breaking. Set received a nerf, and Evelyn got a buff, and Senna also received a slap on the wrist. Small things kind of here and there. It was a pretty similar case with patch 10.9, but there were a couple of big, small changes that occurred. Kayn got a massive buff this patch, and since then he's been a pretty popular jungle pick. Not only was his clear speed increased, Kayn's W slow was increased, and he also gained some extra pushing power. Inevitably, this made him an amazing jungler, and we also saw a tiny but massive nerf in the jungle. This was the patch where Karthus lost 5 movement speed. Throwback to 5 movement speed nerfs. While we're talking about how these changes are often huge, we'll just let the memory of those memes settle for a little bit. Oh yeah, right, and Wukong got nerfed again this patch. And this is why the 200 years meme will probably never die. Patch 10.10 was a heaven send for bot laners. Miss Fortune finally got nerfed this patch. She was an absolute tyrant down there, and for the first time in a while, you could find games where someone wasn't picking her. Everything was going splendidly until a new contender took her place. With Miss Fortune out of the picture, it was time for a new bully to show up and make everyone's lives miserable. Someone has to do it, and this is around the time where Varus decided it was his time. Lethality Varus could take you out, but not in the way that you'd like. A single, fully charged Q could leave you unable to join a fight, and it was absolutely oppressive to play against and lane against. But things get better, eventually, just not all at once. Patch 10.11 was a roller coaster of emotions. It was like bowling a strike, then throwing 2 gutter balls in your next frame. This patch was the greatest blessing marksman players saw all year. Aside from specific cases, marksmen received some extra base health and buffs to their core items. Zeal became a much stronger purchase, and the extra movement speed would prove to be immensely helpful when trying to kite the variety of bruisers and divers that they had to face. So where did they go wrong, you might ask? Well, Volibear was released. Again, Volibear felt weak upon release, with some pretty poor results to start things off. He received a hotfix to help him find success, and the ticking time bomb started its timer at this point. This is also the patch that brought back Luck's support. She got a big buff to her E that made her feel extremely powerful. Her laning became much more threatening with the buffed slow, and the hype train had embarked on its journey. Now starting with patch 10.12, we've got some pretty memorable changes. Do you guys remember that Cassiopeia nerf that actually increased her win rate? Now this one was silly, and I think all the memes towards this one were absolutely justified. Cassiopeia lost some base health and armor, but was given some magic resistance as compensation. With the mid lane being a role dominated by magic damage champions, this change inevitably backfired, and Cassiopeia came out stronger than before. And it was also around this time that tank Fiddlesticks began trending. His ability to drain immense amounts of health from minion waves made him much stronger than you'd expect. This patch nerfed his healing off minions, but it wouldn't be enough to eliminate the trend altogether. With Varus' dominance bleeding into the competitive scene, Riot finally took a stand this patch and absolutely gutted him. Also, Volibear got another buff, but man, if only Riot had known. If only we had all known, to be honest. Most players still thought Volibear was weak, but this buff was going to set him off. Runes received some big changes this patch as well. The biggest changes were to Guardian and Predator. Guardian lost its movement speed bonus, but gained a huge quality of life buff to make it more reliable. Predator received an overhaul, having its cooldown reduced, damage reduced, and also began requiring an enemy champion within its huge range in order to provide a movement speed bonus. Following up though, we had a beautiful patch with patch 10.13. Aphelios got nerfed yet again, and Cassiopeia received a nerf that actually nerfed her this time. This patch also marked Gnar's 4th buff this season, 5 if you include the one he got from preseason. He's seen better days and definitely needed some love this season. What I think was the biggest change this patch was the buff to Nunu. This is when AP Nunu became a thing, and that giant snowball became a source of dread for the entire player base. AP Nunu becoming the next big thing was honestly mind-blowing. Seeing videos of Faker just running it down with a giant snowball and smurfing in high elo games was mind-boggling. While there were doubters and those who ridiculed the idea of AP Nunu, it turned out that this build wasn't troll at all. As silly as it looked, it was effective, and no side lane was ever safe, as Nunu essentially had a silent Scion ult on a much lower cooldown. Equally as important though was the nerf to Yuumi. This is when Yuumi's E received a massive nerf. It would from this point forward cost a flat percent of her mana, meaning that she would have to use it much more sparingly than before. Yuumi got gutted by this patch as she was beginning to become a far too dominant pick everywhere. So yeah, healing was a big issue. Yuumi got nerfed because of it, and to keep things fair, Riot had to nerf certain systems as well. Death's Dance and Conqueror were nerfed this patch, because of guess what? The healing was broken. Champions that weren't intended to use this item or keystone were, and Riot didn't like that. Next up was patch 10.14, which shook up the jungle meta significantly. Karthus got a buff intended to bring him back into the mid lane, but you know how players are. He just ended up becoming a stronger jungler and dominated the patch. Kha'Zix also received a massive buff to his Q, and man, let's just keep it short, this was one bug that you couldn't squash. He won this patch for sure and quickly climbed up to the top of tier lists. This patch was also when mid-Pyke got nerfed. While Pyke was created as a support assassin, players had taken him as a solo laner. He received a bunch of changes, mostly aimed at his defenses and nerfing them. Playing him in solo lanes wasn't as reliable following this patch, but there are still a decent number of players making it work. Varus got nerfed yet again this patch. This was the final nail in his coffin, and my boy just hasn't been the same ever since. Volibear and Wukong got nerfed this patch, and it's safe to say that the game is much better because of these nerfs. For several patches, they were left to run rampant, and patch 10.14 finally did something about it. Patch 10.15 was the patch that Lilia was released. She's a bit tricky, so players weren't doing too hot with her, but we know today that she's fairly popular and has a ton of potential as a pick. Riot by now had learned from their previous mistakes and instead allowed time to do all the major balancing instead. No more buffing champions just because their numbers were underperforming, because it would usually just lead to them becoming super OP in the long run. As a side note, Aphelios got nerfed. Again. With Varus gone, as in actually gone, the bottom lane could finally be a place where players could be free and a diverse meta could flourish. But then Caitlyn got buffed and then the fiesta began once again. Tank Fiddlesticks was nerfed once again this patch, and since then, we really haven't seen players run it anymore. Thank God. The biggest change aside from Lilia's release was a mini rework to Swain. He got a ton of changes to make him function more effectively as a mid laner. His Q could pass through champions, his W's range was increased significantly, and he got all sorts of quality life changes. Yone's release was the iconic point of patch 10.16. The Spirit Blossom event was underway, and we saw some beautiful trailers depicting Yasuo's past. His brother would join the fray, and was pretty OP upon release as well. Hecarim got a random buff this patch that absolutely broke him, and he would proceed to stampede over Summoner's Rift, like how Mufasa... Okay, never mind. Nimbus Cloak received a nerf this patch as well. This rune was a go-to for junglers, marksmen, and specific champions. Too powerful, so Riot cut back on its power. Patch 10.17 was a patch of nerfs. Caitlyn and Hecarim were dominant picks in their respective roles, and got nerfs in response. Hecarim just had a bit of his previous buff cut back. It was also this patch where we saw the Sona Lux duo that had been running rampant get nerfed as well. They didn't get too much time in the spotlight, but we did see it used competitively in some games. Sona and Lux's utility were just too powerful at the time, and they topped the leaderboards as bot laners as well as supports. Both champions received nerfs this patch, and while the duo is still pretty strong, it's not nearly as broken as it once was. Qiyana randomly got nerfed this patch, and there was an outrage in the community over it. Why was she getting nerfed all of a sudden? No one really knew, but it turns out that she was pretty OP in elite levels of play and the Chinese super servers. Of course, with Yone OP, he got nerfed this patch as well. Ahri was supposed to come out a lot stronger on patch 10.18, but she ironically got nerfed. She received some quality of life buffs with some precautions taken to ensure she didn't become too strong. However, these precautions were a bit excessive, and the increased mana cost actually left Ahri weaker than before. By this time, it was also clear that Misfortune got nerfed a bit too hard, and was finally in a place where Riot could actually buff her instead. Set was proving to be too powerful of a pick. He was a superstar flex top, jungle, mid, and support. This patch was the one where Set received a ton of changes to encourage players to not build him full tank. Full tank Set would lose some damage, while building some AD would leave him at around the same power level. Patch 10.19. We're getting pretty close to where we're at right now. Patch 10.19 was Samira. One word, Samira. An absolute monster blessed with everything a player could want in a champion. Explosive, self-sufficient, stylish, you name it. Samira still holds ridiculous ban rates even after her nerfs. So once again, we've got some more 200 years memes. This patch undid the damage to Ahri as well, making sure that the change did in fact end up becoming an overall buff for her. Believe it or not, patch 10.19 was Aphelios' first time getting buffed this season. After getting gutted, kicked while laying on the floor, and repeatedly thrown around, he finally got some love. The other bottom lane change for this patch was a nerf to Caitlyn to finally take her out of the spotlight. Patch 10.21 was a pretty vanilla one. We had another Aphelios buff, and to nobody's surprise, a nerf to Samira. Nerfs didn't matter though, because players treated her the same way anyway. Nimbus Cloak was nerfed once again this patch, as it's still too powerful. It's a pretty great rune, and I'm sure most players are well aware of this. And now, we're finally in the present day. Alright guys, that was a lengthy but nostalgic look back on the past year. Thanks so much for tuning in, and let me know what your favorite memory of the season was in the comments. Once again, if you guys are trying to improve, I heavily encourage you guys to check out our website, and also hit that sub button so you can stay up to date with us. I'll catch you guys in our next video.